Right, let's turn to this now. Deputy President Paul Mashatile says he'll consult with parties like EFF, UDM and ATM to map out legislative frameworks on coalition governments. At the same time, the DA has accused the ANC of trying to hijack the dialogue on coalitions, which was held in Cape Town this weekend. More on this, we're joined now by Service Commission Chairperson, Dr Somadoda Fikeni. And let's take your views also tonight, 072-110-5584. And here's a question for you. Do you think the gathering of the parties to have dialogue on the framework that is going to determine what happens going forward as far as stability of governance, especially at local government level, represents a turning point for efficient and professional approach to coalition politics in South Africa? What are your thoughts? Do weigh in on that. Dr. Fikeni, good evening. Good to have you, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me, and greetings to your viewers.
So let's talk first and foremost about the timing of it, right? It's challenging to some that so late in our democracy, especially at the time when it seems the support for the coalition, rather for the majority party, is waning, that they would want to call for this conversation to happen. What's your reflection on the timing of when it happened? Others says it should have happened a long time ago, I suppose, when the ANC was still pretty much popular and had a stable majority. They should have called all the other parties and talk about coalitions. Now they're talking about coalitions because they are seeing that they are almost on their way out the door.
Well, I do think that some people could have that view, but the reality is that we do have national interest, and we've seen what has happened more recently with the coalitions, that in the absence of regulations, where you have heightened suspicions and trust deficit, the people who are hit the most is actually the ordinary citizens and residents who are waiting to receive services. So when you have the instability, the turnover, which is so high, it has nothing to do with which party is bigger, which party is less, but more about realizing what a maturing and evolving democracy may need in order to regulate. And this is shown by international experience. But not only that, it is also one thing we should have predicted to say, with proportional representative system that is based on party list across the world, it often evolves in the direction of coalitions. And therefore, it ought to have been done a long time ago. But the reality is that the recent developments have actually jerked society into realizing the importance of regulating this. So it is not just a partisan exercise. It is something bigger than any ruling party, any opposition party, or any party in parliament or outside. It's more about the society itself, which is realizing that this unregulated space has become problematic.
How do you promote consensus then in that context where, for example, parties don't even see eye to eye about the type of framework that should be put in place? So you've got the Deputy President saying in his speech there is correlation but no causality when it comes to the collapse of the municipalities, metro municipalities in particular, and the formation of coalitions. So coalitions don't necessarily trigger the collapse, but there is correlation, not causality. And then you have parties, smaller parties like the ATM saying, well, you are just merely scapegoating for the collapse of the municipalities. Really have got nothing to do with coalitions, but got to do with the ANC wanting to hold on to power via backdoor. So they are not even on consensus around that issue. So how do you promote a framework in that context?
Well, we often forget that in South Africa there was a time when we were on the brink of a civil war or a racial civil strife in the late 80s early 90s, when leaders, realizing the risk, rising to a certain level of appreciating what was bigger than their parties and what was bigger than their partisan interest, came together. At that time, you could not have seen contrasting and entities that had been at war with each other, the apartheid regime, liberation organizations, and many other entities which joined to look for a common path. So it is not always the case that you negotiate with friends. It is precisely the time when you see the national interest and the risks and the catastrophic outcome that would be there should you see the instability, the uncertainty, the turnover you had seen in some of the municipalities playing itself out at a provincial level. So to me, I do think that society, civil society, which was there, trade unions, business sector, and so forth, were urging political parties to rise to that occasion to say, whatever trust deficit is there, whatever political culture within parties and between parties might have caused these challenges of trust deficit, it is time now to rise to that occasion and look for something bigger than what party needs, look for something bigger than what party will benefit or lose out of this exercise, and also appreciate international benchmarking and experiences, and appreciate research work which is evidence-based, which is empirical, rather than the jostling that you see in the discourse. So if we were to lift this discussion above partisan interests, yes, where parties believe that there are certain challenges that might come, it is very important to establish common principles.
Yes.
It is also important to start a new culture and a journey of transparency, of honesty, so that the suspicions that come out of all the jostling that we have seen and the political contestation are removed in the national interest.
So what could we possibly then talk about inserting into that framework, as you put it, that would promote fidelity to national interest?
Well, I do think that the first thing, there should be an agreement on some basic principles and conventions, wherein we say the Constitution is the foundation, but also the interest of the citizens is far more important than the considerations of political players, because after all, it is the citizens who elect and ask the political players to represent themselves. So if it is oriented towards development, towards service delivery, towards advancement of national interests, those are some of the basic principles that should be the founding base of anything that we craft going forward, so that you remove the personal interest, you remove the partisan interest, or you remove the factional interest, which might be part of the current political equation, and start looking at what has happened elsewhere. I keep coming back to the issue of saying we are not the first country to get into this situation.
Yes.
We are not the first country to deal with coalitions. So it would be better if we escape and disabuse ourselves from this notion of South African exceptionalism and say, what does science, what does empirical evidence tell us about experiences from elsewhere?
All right.
But not only from elsewhere, from within the country, because as it emerged in the conference itself, some coalitions have worked, but they have not made headlines over the years, even before 2016. But some have failed. And more recently, the turnover and the instability and the barter system and the jostling is the one that had become more prominent. and worrisome in many ways.
So let's stay with that point a little bit that you're raising. It has happened elsewhere, but here's how the Deputy President is couching that particular debate. He says, well, yes, it has happened everywhere else and there have been coalitions elsewhere in the world, but they are happening in a context that is different to ours. Ours is unique in the sense that we have unique sociological and political characteristics. For example, we have a country that is coming out from a colonialism of a special kind, unlike what we've seen elsewhere in the world. But we've also got social structure and economic structure issues that are centered in all our endeavors. So we've got something called political careerism. So people who are into this purely for career. So they've got no other job. And if their time in office ends, they've got no other means of making a living. And saying, when we have this conversation, yes, coalitions have happened elsewhere, but in South Africa they've got these unique features. What do you say to that?
Well, I wouldn't exaggerate South African exceptionalism, because in the same conversation, Kenyan experience was brought in, and the African experiences, which are similar to ours, were brought in. Places like Latin America, former colonies, had coalitions in South Africa. So to that extent, I wouldn't overemphasize the South African exceptionalism. Yes, whatever you take has to be contextualized within the context of a particular country. But we cannot always exaggerate and want new solutions. And it is for that reason, whether it's load shedding or migration control or many other developmental challenges, that we ought to be looking at other countries and say, how have they done it? Some have simpler answers, and that is to take, yes, custom to our situation. But I wouldn't want us to over-exaggerate the international experiences and our uniqueness. We have to find a balance in that sense.
So let's go back then to the coalitions being the will of the people. So if the coalitions are the will of the people, shouldn't we be going to the people themselves to tell us exactly what the framework should look like? Because if we go to the parties would, like the ANC, want to emphasize a policy framework that is leaning towards supporting parties with most votes. Because by and large, they will still get a huge chunk of the votes.
Well, that is the reason why civil society was included. Faith-based organizations were included, scholars were included, and international benchmarking was done to make sure that political parties alone are not the ones who will be the alpha and the omega of this discourse. Self should be taken note of. But even if you have a referendum or you were to have citizens' participation, ultimately this has to be adopted in Parliament, which means you're going back to the political players. Hence, we have to find a mechanism again and say, how have other countries had a consensus-building dialogue? And how South Africa itself, we can learn from different epochs of our history where there was divergence, consensus was discussed until it was found.
Pulling on a tool like the thresholds, for example, of admissibility of no confidence motions, is that the best tool that we probably can use in terms of ensuring some governance stability?
Well, I do think that I wouldn't be prescriptive, except to say from the discussions that were coming from political parties themselves, from international benchmarking, from civil society, trade unions, business. They were saying the vote of no confidence should not be open to abuse, where every other week you have a vote of no confidence. There should be some considerations when the situation is serious enough or somebody has committed an extreme crime instead of simply saying, I've disagreed with you now, let's call for a vote of no confidence, because it has a destabilizing effect on the ground, and it has a destabilizing effect on service delivery itself.
And do you see now coming out of this, because, you know, the fears that the ruling ANC has got a tendency of going into these issues and just coming up with a bill, for example, something like the NHI, which then it becomes contested, it becomes a long process, gets challenged in courts and whatnot, and so on and so forth. Do you think they're going to just go ahead and draft some kind of bill? And is that the direction that they should take coming out of this? Or they should be seeking much broader consensus before they put that bill together?
Yes, I do think that the mistake that we could make is to make this discussion to be about the ruling party. We do have 65 million or so South Africans, and we do have a number of political parties. Yes, you have a ruling party. It is an important voice. But when you have problems that have compounded as they have, you need maximum participation. You need maximum consensus sufficient enough to create legitimacy in any process that is created. The most unfortunate thing is that some of these processes, because they have not been undertaken for a long time, they are coming too close to elections, and therefore everything that is done tend to be colored with the suspicion of what could be the equation here, what could be the calculation going into elections. And that is why this process ought to be transparent, and it ought to have maximum participation and the principle of co-creation, knowing that political parties alone have become so much divided and the trust levels are so high, they will need the entire society, like civil society, trade unions, faith-based organizations, scholars, and so forth, to get into this space, especially those people who are not necessarily interested in saying, I'll lose this seat or gain that seat, but rather say what is in the interest of society and what has worked elsewhere and what has worked in the past, even in our own experiences.
Dr. Fikeni, I appreciate your time. Let me thank you so much for coming in tonight, Dr. Somadoda Fikeni, the Public Service Commission chairperson.